Welcome back, or welcome for the first time today to part 2 of Dispossession and its Legacies, Comparisons, Intersections, and Connections. Specifically panel 2 of the day, Memory, Narrative, and Aesthetic Form. So we're glad to have you back, or we're glad to have you here for the first time as we think through these questions of memory, narrative, and representations of them on dispossession and the afterlives. So for our panel today, our second panel, we have Jacob Caponi, a PhD student in sociology at the University of Michigan, who will give a talk on a paper co-authored with Professor Fatma Müge Göçek, who's a professor of sociology here at Michigan. We also have Claire Baytas, a PhD student in comparative and world literature at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, as well as Elyse Semerdjian, a professor of Islamic world / Middle Eastern history at Whitman College, and myself, Helen Makhdoumian, one of the 2 Mnemonics postdoctoral fellows. We're also joined by Dirk Moses, Frank Porter Graham Distinguished Professor of Global Human Rights History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who was one of our keynotes last night, so we're grateful for you to be back present with us today. Our panel takes up representations of dispossession and its legacies, with a focus on film, literature, and testimony. It features analyses of a film on the silences of a Greek Orthodox woman dispossessed from the Black Sea region in 1916, of settlement and state memory work in Armenian American and American Indian novel, and of lived memory practices pertaining to the 1915 Armenian and 1994 Rwandan genocides. So if you are joining us again, we'll follow the same format as earlier today. If you're joining us for the first time today, I'll give you a little context. This panel is following a workshop format with pre-circulated papers. So the presentations will be about 10 to 15 minutes as our panelists give us a glimpse of what they wrote about as we saw their papers, and we'll tune you, the audience in. And then afterwards, we'll shift to a discussion. We'll proceed in the order of the program. So with those brief introductions, I now invite Jacob Caponi to give his paper, again co-authored with Fatma Müge Göçek, on how difficult paths complicate the present, comparative analysis of the 1915 Armenian genocide and 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. So Jacob, we're glad you're here, and we're glad that everyone else is with us too. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to all the rest of the organizers and everyone attending. Can you all see my screen okay?
I don't think you have shared yet.
I haven't, okay. And we just practiced, okay. Is it working yet?
There we go.
Okay, perfect. So thank you all for attending. So this is a paper part of a book project that Müge and I were invited to contribute to. So this is looking at a comparative analysis of using the 1915 Armenian genocide and the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. So just briefly, kind of situating where we're doing. So we're taking up Alexander Hinton's question in comparative genocide about why we need to ask, are certain cases forgotten, remembered, recognized, or even intentionally hidden or written out of history? So we could answer this question with one word and just say power, but I'm going to go through the presentation and go through a little bit about how that power comes to be, how it's expressed, and what it means when it changes over time, space, and the person that is giving the representation. So a brief introduction about genocide and the comparative part. Yesterday there was, Dirk Moses kind of touched on this in the naming of the genocide, but Samantha Power in her book titled it The Age of Genocide, the 20th Century, because there were just so many that were happening. And often we get sidetracked by just the Holocaust happening. But as we know, there are genocides before, after, and still ongoing. But there's often a contention of comparisons. So when we compare different genocides, each genocide is considered to be unique, have its own qualities, characteristics that is just unimaginable, right? It's the crime of all crimes. How could this be compared to something else? But we do know that comparative analysis reveals patterns. And as sociologists, we look at the memory making and the collective memory and what that unveils for opportunities, especially for transnational solidarity. So how can we look at these in a way to move forward in order to prevent them and respond to them in better ways? So post-genocide processes are very difficult because of the inherent difficulties in genocide. So there's a formulation of the word as well as the concept, the management of the word as well as the actual concept happening, and then the execution of the actual genocide and the execution of the word genocide. All of those carry different powers and meanings depending on where you are in the world. So what we do is we kind of look for our flashlight. So Anne Swidler has cultural repertoires, which she kind of uses as her toolbox, her cultural toolbox. And what we're doing is trying to figure out the meanings, the habits, the skills of how people use these actions or strategies for actions. So we as the scholars have our flashlight and we're looking along time, space, meaning, and concept, and kind of just try to figure out which time and space on each meaning and what that means for each individual, in our case being genocide. And in the background there, there's cultural repertoires going about. So I'm not a math person, so don't take this graph as being finite, but gives us an idea. So we also want to be reflexive, right? So our flashlight is not the only flashlight. This is about collaboration, looking at other people's flashlights, shining them on each other and seeing what positions of power say about different events, as well as what our own positions say about certain events. So in doing that, we come up with this like tripart of understanding why genocide becomes contentious. So there's a conceptual formulation, there's a social actor negotiation, and contextualization. So we'll go through these three parts with the case of Turkey as well as the case of Rwanda. So as well as those three parts, we also have parts that they move through. So the part one is a difficult conceptualization formation. So there's ambiguities in what happens in naming this actual genocide. There's public secrecy and public accountability, and who is able to announce that a genocide is happening and who is affected by when a genocide is not announced. So if we look initially after the Holocaust, that's when the term genocide was announced. I won't go into too much detail about that as there's a lot written about it, but what's not as much in the public is that the Civil Rights Congress from the United States charged the United States with genocide against Black people in 1951 at the UN Convention. And Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer who coined the term genocide, responded via New York Times post or New York Times op-ed stating that by no stretch of the imagination can one discover in the United States an extent or plan. Now we know that that is not true if we consider our different reflexive positions about what was happening in the 1950s and beyond that in the United States. But according to Lemkin, this did not qualify as the type of genocide, even though the proclamation they put forth addressed how it touched on each one of those points. So this top-down process by which international law is the one proclaiming what a genocide is or isn't is part of the problem. So relational approach to the sociology of genocide asks, what are the boundaries of genocide and how are they changing over time? Now in the US, there's calls for the genocide against Native Americans, the genocide against enslaved people, and those are becoming more apparent as time goes on and power kind of moves throughout time. And then who is ensuring accountability? So just naming them as genocides doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as giving back power to those people or allowing power to be a shared process. So we also look at the intersection of time and power. So the Armenian genocide is in the early 20th century and the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi is in the late 20th century. So both one is before the Holocaust, the other is after the Holocaust. So in the prior to the Holocaust, Turkey's denial claims that genocide wasn't a word yet, so we cannot claim that this was a genocide. They also say that the word genocide is a Western tool in order to avoid the accountability of colonization in the Ottoman Empire. However, in Rwanda, the term genocide is after the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, around the world, we heard cries of never again, we cannot let this happen again. And as we know, it continues to happen. And the case in Rwanda is just one of those cases that happened after the Holocaust. So as we say that temporality is not what makes these events different. Instead, it's the periodization that I'll get into afterwards of colonization, nation state building, internal polarization, and then the meaning making, which kind of make the two seem similar in how that collective memory is a tool for nation building. So one example of this is naming. So like I said, to name the Armenian genocide is to create tension, because if we were to name the Armenian genocide a genocide, there has to be a perpetrator and a victim based on our binary. And there can also be bystanders in the tripartite example. So if we were to call that a genocide, then that means that Turkey would have to be the perpetrator, which would then make the people in charge of current Turkey responsible for those acts. Whereas in the case of Rwanda, if we were to not name it the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, which most in the West do not realize is the official name, if we were to call it the Rwandan genocide, it seems like all parties were involved in that genocide. So it's very contentious in the space of Rwanda to make sure that you're naming it as the genocide against the Tutsi, because the Tutsis were the victims in this case. Otherwise, it would make it seem that the other ethnicities and other parties involved were also part of the perpetrators. So moving into part 2, the difficult social actor negotiation. So there's diverging standpoints in practice. So the experimental level, which we consider to be the local informal social actors. So these are people on the ground, these are people in everyday life. And then there's the academic level, right? So thinking about in the ivory tower, these are people who write, think about all of these things. In Western modernity, we value the academic level. We say that these people are experts, they have the experience of knowing theory and methods, and they can kind of stand back and look at this from an unbiased kind of viewpoint. But we know that that's not true as we move into understanding how identities and experience influence how theories are made. So despite that, we have naturalized the standpoint of those in academia, we must also consider the experiences of people on the ground, which Professor Müge does in her book by using memoirs. So looking at how these different experiences are different on the subnational level, because we cannot take the state as just one actor in this. There's also processes happening within the state. So as an example, we have the variable experience within the Armenian case. So new evidence is also showing, well, not as new, more recent, I guess, is that the Greeks and others were also part of the victims of the genocide. So if we have a binary, a victim perpetrator, that is not going to be adequate in saying who is like involved in this case. And we can apply this to other cases as well. As there's just one group, the perpetrator, one group, the victim, is often the story told, but there's many more groups, identities involved in that. So we take up Rothberg's implicated subject, which basically says that individuals assume different roles throughout collective memory, or sorry, within collective violence. And these are dynamic over time and space. Also with variable knowledge, so we have to think about how we are accessing knowledge. Often during genocide, when it's about to end, the people who are orchestrating the genocide will destroy documents, they'll destroy buildings, all evidence that they can. And the people who have been experienced that are traumatized by the experience. So to immediately go in as scholars and start asking questions doesn't always give us the best answers that we want, and it also harms the people involved. So many of the survivors of the Armenian genocide wrote memoirs, but these are often failed to circulate in the public space. So we also have to know about the difference between the private and the public and where knowledge is executed. In our side of inquiry, so as we move into our side of inquiry, we want to take up reflexivity. So this is not just the addition of multiple viewpoints. So it's not just that I am a white man studying this and Professor Müge is a woman from Turkey that is studying this, but it is how these different alternate forms may be better for our knowledge production. So as sociologists, our task is to place actors' logic within the power structures that they conceal. So it's not just that different people are looking at this, but it's that we're doing it in a way that is better for society. So then this last part is about the different contextualization. So due to time, I'll make this quick. So we all, or sorry, the 4 points that we have kind of conceptualized as being similar for genocides is that there's a point for colonization, nation state formation, and internal polarization. So these I go in more depth in the paper, but for, I guess, brevity's sake, this is how kind of that power modernity enters into the sphere of the narrative of genocide. So someone takes over another spot, within that a national identity is formed, and then internal polarization is when groups are charged against each other. What we focus on mainly is the post-genocide re-narration. So this is when the abrogation of accountability by those in power. So they are refusing that they have accountability within this, but that someone else did something bad and now they are here to save you, make you better. Or if we were to acknowledge this violence, that is to say that we also must have been involved in this violence and we cannot do that. So post-genocide government leaders repurpose now the Western rhetoric that people, this is terror, or there's the war on terror within this. We see that people who speak up within these cases are named as terrorists. They are a danger to the nation or the nation state or how we are forming our community and culture. So we must take those people and remove them from that area in order to keep moving with this narrative that abrogates accountability. So in conclusion, we think about collective memory and contentious meaning making. We are arguing that a comparative analysis of collective violence identifies better how these implicated subjects are moving through time and space. When we think about certain groups, they are both perpetrators and victims at different times and different spaces, and to assume that that group remains stable across time and space really creates a false theory of how these events unfold. So basically, post-genocidal re-narration is the ambiguity of the boundaries of genocide. So when we're thinking about the public, private, the time, space, etc. And this demonstrates how post-genocidal processes are shaped then across the time and space are not fully articulated when we do not consider the comparative analysis. And that is all. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jacob. I think that there are a couple of threads that we're already starting to see come out and will carry forward, but especially on the question of identity production and positionality, certainly got it to us through the question of the relationship between victim and perpetrator, bystander, implicated subject, but you're also getting us to temporality and how those kind of positionalities might shape and inform memory work when people experience maybe other collective violence or are maybe a bystander where they might have been a victim in the previous sense. And there's definitely connections to be mapped out with Dirk's talk last night in thinking about temporality and what that might mean for these kind of different positions. So something to hold on to, I think, as we carry it forward. And Elyse, I will now turn it over to you. And Elyse, who will be presenting on If These Bones Could Speak, the genesis of Armenian pilgrimage to Dayr. So turn it over to you. Thanks, Elyse.
Thank you. Is my screen showing? Let me try that again. Can you hear me?
Yes, we had your screen temporarily, so you can.
Okay, great.
Good.
Hello, everyone. So I'm presenting today a segment of a book I am in the process of finishing, like very soon, actually. The book actually looks at embodiment and even explores the materiality of the body as a framework through which to analyze the Armenian genocide. I had not originally intended to include material bones. I was thinking more about the way in which genociders consider the body and gender, and the disintegration of the collective and individual bodies and the restoration and the way that bodies were viewed by humanitarians. But I couldn't help but think about Dayr, especially in light of, excuse me, my slides are not advancing. There you go. Especially in light of the Holy Martyrs Church in Dayr, the only official monument. I mean, there are some smaller monuments inside Syria, but this is probably the most well-known in Armenian collective memory. The memorial is actually in the basement of the church. This church was created by Sarkis Belmanoukian in 1990. And perhaps you're familiar with this scene, which is the ossuary in the basement, in which bones collected in Dayr were placed in the ossuary with sand, kind of creating this burial, the scene of burial for which many victims did not receive as a surrogate burial, if you will. And so what I really wanted to do was reconstruct what I'm calling a pilgrimage of Armenians in light of this lost monument, because you may know that in 2014, this monument was destroyed, allegedly by Islamic State. And so now with the loss of the monument, there's this sort of, again, pressing issue about creating a monument. But I also argue that for a long time, this place had a lot of absence of care. This is a very large region in around Dayr, and there were very few markers considering the vastness of the space. So what I began to do was create what I'm calling a kind of an affective archive. I'm deeply interested in the emotions and interactions of people with the space, using Armenian writings, oral histories that have been archived, but also 14 interviews of my own, and also including photography to map out what is this larger territory. I did not include Ras Al Ain in the study because Ras Al Ain in the north is a place that actually few of these pilgrims traveled to. A few people had, but mostly Dayr became a major site for these travelers. You could call it a dark pilgrimage or dark tourism. And so my concepts that I'm working with here, some of them are my own, some of them I'm borrowing. First of all, I'm thinking about Dayr not just as a landscape. Sam Dolmy's dissertation came up, and he's done an amazing job of looking at the environment and sort of the space of al-Zur, but I wanted to move beyond that to talk about it more as an assemblage, as a place of loss, of affect. Affect includes, a range of emotions that people feel and express when they're talking about al-Zur, or that they felt when they were there. I'm also interested in the materiality of bone. I know that this is a topic that can produce visceral responses. I'm interested in responses of disgust as well as responses of reverence with bone. This is where descendants remember dismemberment through ritual and memory work. And this is where I'm drawing upon scholars in death studies, including people who work with relics and sort of the meaning of relics in different religious communities. I also have borrowed from Roma Sendaika's amazing work on unmarked spaces of the Holocaust in Poland in particular. She calls these non-sites of memory as sort of a counterpoint to Pierre Nora's theory. Unmarked spaces where there are hauntings or uncanny experiences, drawing on that Freudian concept of unheimlich and the unsettled feeling that people have within spaces that are unmarked. We can go deeper into anthropology to think about, humans and the desire to name the dead, the desire to inter the dead and prepare proper ritual. But when those rituals are not executed, we're talking about spaces that are deeply haunted or have a spectrality. And so the absence of care and exile, I argue, has made it so that prosthetic memory, that is memory that's transmitted through oral or even various kinds of mediated accounts. These mediated written accounts include Armenian archives, include what Armenians were writing about al-Zur in real time, survivors who are penning their memoirs or documenting their feelings about al-Zur. I think these are all important tools of remembrance, and this is the affective archive that's tapped by pilgrims when they go to al-Zur. Because the space is unmarked, they draw upon that prosthetic memory in order to guide their way, or what I call feel their way through the desert. And finally, my contribution is bone memory. It's from an essay I published a few years ago, but I use bone memory to describe these vernacular memory practices. They're outside the state's purview in the sense that these are not state rituals. This is not in commemorative time. These are not formal rituals. Often they are rituals of Armenians' own makings. It includes what I call empathic excavations. These are disinterring bones, oftentimes with Dayr Arabs who are engaged in these activities with pilgrims, the haptics of bone collecting, the holding and the touching of bones. And it's not by mistake that Armenians call these masukner. They're referring to a tradition of relic keeping that Armenians have long had. And so I want to take the bones and make them into a serious practice that we should think about as a serious memory practice among Armenians that are documented in photographs, oral and written accounts. So I'm going to start with a couple of things I'm tinkering with, which includes a letter from an Armenian humanitarian who you may not have heard of, Hovhannisyan, and if you have, bravo. I learned about Hovhannisyan from Anna Alexanyan. She did a small profile of him in the Armenian Review, and I thought I would go and look at his archive to see, I was really looking to see what he was writing about women, actually. And then I came across a letter that I continue to sort of be amazed by. Now, Hovhannisyan was an Armenian American. He had immigrated to the United States. He went back in 1918. He tried to join the Armenian Foreign Legion and was rejected because of his age. He was considered too old at 50. If I've made you feel bad about your age, I apologize, but he was actually really disappointed. And so what he did is he created a one-man operation in the desert between Aleppo and Baghdad. He rescued more than 2,000 Armenians. And here he's dressed in traditional Bedouin garb that he often wore as he went out to actually purchase Armenians back from Bedouin households where they were being kept. And in a letter to his relative, Mirak, who he wrote many intimate letters to, he said, "Yesterday, I arrived here to visit the place of the Armenian graveyard, al-Zur. The 200,000 is in parentheses, a reference to how many died there. And he said to collect and send fragments of Armenians from here to Cilicia, a reference to the Catholicos Sis. But here he refers to sending a sample inside the letter. And what he's referring to is that he collected bones and he inserted some bones inside the letter. So he inserted a sample of bones inside the letter that shows the Turkish monster's crimes, a real picture of the poor exiles wandering in the desert. And here he does this, he makes this move that happens a lot in these writings. He starts to envision what the bones would look like clothed with as humans, as individual human names. So he writes, see how Arafni, her shoes are made with wrapped rags around her feet, swollen, bloody, full of wounds, refusing to walk. And then he refers to a woman, Ofsana, who's interred her child who has died of starvation. And then a woman named Azniv, who was covered with torn clothes, complaining with a desperate look to the civilized world. So he makes this radical leap of imagination to take the bones and give them life. They become agentic, they become humans, and they become, in this case, 3 different profiles of women. This is not unusual, but I will come back to another example of this, this way in which this radical remembrance finds its way into Armenian documents. And then I have another fragment. I'm very interested in fragments, remnants, things outside of traditional state archives. I'm interested in things that incidentally perhaps got archived. And I came across Giovanni Chiarano. He is was a Dayr Armenian. And he recalled that in 1928, the local Dayr Armenian community gathered together, they got a truck, and they drove 10 kilometers away outside of al-Zur to collect bones as a community. They loaded the bones onto the truck. He was a child. He recalled that he held bones in his hand and had his photograph snapped, but he no longer had the photograph, but he remembered the photograph. And what it was a mass killing site outside of al-Zur that the community itself excavated these bones, brought them back to al-Zur, and reinterred them into a place along the banks of the Euphrates, just off the banks of the Euphrates. However, some years later, a farmer tilled up that land and began cultivating it. And so the site, the attempt to name and create a site of memory really failed. But what we have here is just another trace, a piece of evidence in which Armenians were attempting to form a monument. This account is also interesting because he said that some of the bones from that dig, from that excavation, a non-scientific excavation, found their way into a genocide memorial that they had created inside al-Zur and likely made their way to the 1990 monument that was created. I have another example of, and this is just the same time Hamas Doug had gone to al-Zur, the writer, and penned this essay with a skull. This essay really does a lot of the same work as Rupen Harian's work, where the skull becomes agentic, becomes people. I talk about it at length, and I don't want to go over my time, but one of the things that's really interesting about this essay is how even in Manassian's representation here, Hamas Doug is dialoguing with the skull. He actually did collect the skull and bring it back to Lebanon as a muse while he was writing. And one of the things that he does is contemplate, if I had only known the name of that skull, if I only knew the name of that skull. And what he does actually in the center part of the essay is name the skull. And he gives us profiles of different men to whom the skull might have belonged. And all of them are men of the cloth. And at a really important point in the essay, the skull becomes a chalice in the Eucharist that's held above the head of the priest at the pinnacle of Mass. And it really does a lot to kind of make us think about what work he's doing with the bones to sacredize them. But the skull as a chalice in the Eucharist, works its way back to the sacrificed martyrs, giving them the power to witness. And this is what I think might connect with what Helen will be speaking about, this idea of translating death into an act of witnessing. I think that's what we're experiencing here with these essays. And then finally, the bones become even more agentic at the end, and they rise up into a mighty army to reclaim the land, the monasteries, schools, the green fields. And so another thing I consider is the transformation of the land in the course of the killing. I do not know whether the femur sticking up out of the ground here with Vahan Papazian looking upon it is something that's staged, but these photographs have really deep meaning and iconography. And I spend a lot of time analyzing this photograph, which is taken later, and it's my final example for today. In 1938, the Catholic State of Sis sent Harun Hovhannisyan to Dayr al-Zur, and his expedition mirrors in many ways Rupen Heryan's, because he was also a member of the Vorpa Havak team rescuing live bodies in the desert. Well, now, like Haryan, he's also collecting the dead. And he was sent by the Catholicos of Sis to go to Dayr al-Zur to actually get assistance to go inside Turkey to Urfa to retrieve the bodies and the corpses and the remains of Krikor Zorab and Vartkes, the two parliamentarians who were executed in Urfa by the Ottoman government. He tries to get inside, and because it was mentioned last time, I would say a major figure who helps him and assists him is Ali Raza Badr Khan Bey. So the Kurds actually sneak him inside, and here I have from his unpublished memoir, you can see he's dressed like a Kurd. He had a photograph taken and pasted it into his memoir to recall how he tried to go in to retrieve the bodies of the two Armenian members of parliament. However, the place was very heavily guarded. So he returns to Dayr al-Zur, and he finds another, through local Armenian knowledge, he finds another person that he can retrieve and bring back to Sis, which is another Vardabet named Hovhannisyan. And so he excavates those bones along with these bones, which as you can tell from the smallest of the skull, these are children's bones at the base of the Dayr al-Zur bridge, where a number of children were killed. And this iconic, there are a few different photographs, but this one becomes, I think, very iconic because I think of the way the bones are positioned and the gaze to, again, give this death a power of witnessing as an antidote really to the impossibility of witnessing genocide. I think I might have gone over my time, but I just wanted to give you a small sample of some of the writings that I'm looking at and some of the archival photos as I try to reconstruct these pilgrimages. And a great deal of what I'm doing also is drawing upon the oral histories of people I'm collecting who've traveled to Dayr al-Zur up until the war and the uprising and war of 2011. And those are also incredibly rich and detailed, but I just didn't share them today. But thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Elyse. It's really interesting to hear you share the process and kind of the research out loud. And I'm grateful that we had a chance to hear you speak your paper and not just read it, because in this version that we get, affect and emotion much more comes to the fore. And especially through the narration, through your own narration, there's also a layer of affect and emotion that's coming. And that's something, maybe a thread that we'll hold on to when we go into Q&A. And I think that affect and emotion and narration will certainly be relevant as we transition into Claire and your work and what you present for us today. And so I will give a little brief overview with your title again. And so Claire Baytas is presenting for us patterns of marginalization, and Yeşim Ustaoğlu is waiting for the clouds. And so Claire, with that, I will happily turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to the conference organizers for having me. Thank you everyone for being here. What I'm gonna, well, first let me share my screen and make sure I get that part right. Okay. All right. Is it all good? Okay, great. Okay, so what I'm going to share today is an excerpt from a dissertation chapter that I'm in the midst of writing. That was the paper I submitted was part of that draft. And the chapter is about the Turkish filmmaker Yeşim Ustaoğlu. She has been active since the 90s as part of what is termed the new political cinema wave in Turkish cinema. Films that usually deal with the trauma and violence of the past, how they impact the present, also kind of question the nation as a framework. So today, this presentation will focus on Ustaoğlu's Waiting for the Clouds in 2004, which tells the story of a Greek Orthodox woman in Turkey whose Pontic Greek community was deported from the Black Sea region in 1916. And the film takes place nearly 60 years later, when this woman, who now goes by the name of Ayşe, has returned to her birthplace and lives in a somewhat estranged fashion within the community that's now settled there. Although she has physically returned, the film demonstrates how her existence is now governed by an oppressive state surveillance, or what Ustaoğlu terms a government paranoia that constantly looks to suppress what it deems threats to the nation state or to unified national identity. So in what I'm going to go through today, sort of my argument that Waiting for the Clouds juxtaposes a set of characters, including Ayşe, also a set of secondary characters, who are all forced to the physical and social margins of society due to this intensive state presence. And so in this sense, the legacy of 1916 that Ayşe embodies in the context of this film is a proliferation of people in the same location who become marginalized or even victims of state violence due to this continual desire to suppress threats. So by intertwining memories of 1916 and the diegetic present, which is 1975, in the film story, Ustaoğlu enables Michael Rothberg's notion of multi-directional memory, which many of you may be familiar with, this idea of how disparate memories emerge in productive dialogue rather than in competition. And so in this case, I consider the stakes how multi-directional connections function specifically here. I'm saying that they reveal these common threads across time and the experiences of different people in the same place, living under late Ottoman and then successive Turkish governments. And also I want to kind of look at the formal side. I want to underline the particular cinematic techniques. Here I'll talk namely about cross-cutting or parallel editing that Ustaoğlu employs to draw these connections. In a longer version of the paper, I go through other techniques, but I'm just going to talk about cross-cutting today. And so it's also important to note that when I go through this paper, I'm not arguing that the film proposes equivalencies, empirical sorts of equivalencies between distinct histories like 1916 or 1975, or between the sufferings of the different people that the film portrays. Instead, more in line with Rothberg's notion of multidirectionality, the paper explores the effects of the creative intertwining of different histories and people in the film. So in the film's press kit, Ustaoğlu states that she intended the state-mandated deportations of the Pontic Greek community away from the Black Sea village of what is today Tirebolu in the winter of 1916 are meant to be the historical background of Ayşe's story. So in the film, Ayşe, who was born Eleni, informs us that most of her family died due to the brutal conditions of the march southward. Only she and her brother, Nico, survive. Ayşe is adopted by a Turkish family in Mersin and lives with them under a false name and false ethno-religious identity for the rest of her life, while her brother is put in an orphanage and then deported to Greece. And the film is mainly about, the plot is about Ayşe's process of slowly facing her traumatic past in the 1975 present. And it also portrays the activities of two local village boys, pictured here, Mehmet and Cengiz, who spend most of their time at the fringes of the village. I'm interested in this question of why she sets the film in 1975 instead of 1916. And I want to suggest that it allows Ustaoğlu to portray certain aspects of the political ambiance in 1916 that led to the deportations, how that still lingers on in 1975. So through this juxtaposition of 1916 and 1975, Ustaoğlu underscores the repeated negative effects of state institutions and their policies on what she terms ordinary people. I'll turn to a quote from her press kit where she comments on this, and she says that, "In Waiting for the Clouds, I wanted to touch on how government paranoia puts pressure on ordinary lives. If there had been tolerance, Ayşe would not have had to keep her ethnic identity a secret for 50 years. She's counting since the 20s, not 16. But in 1970s Turkey, paranoia and a fear of others was on the rise, while tolerance towards minority ethnic groups diminished." So this government paranoia term that Ustaoğlu uses, I interpret in the context of this film as this tendency of the state to designate threats to national security or unity, which kind of reflect the sort of political dynamics that scholars have referred to as Turkey's national security culture, or its tendency to continually identify internal and external enemies. We also propose that this dynamic could be reformulated using the terms from recent scholarship on vulnerability advanced by scholars like Judith Butler, where you would say in this case, the institutions of power, such as the Turkish state, co-opt discourses of vulnerability by claiming themselves to be vulnerable, and thereby defending their oppressive policies as necessary for self-defense. I think the film is kind of problematizing this by saying, however, these oppressive policies justified by vulnerability ultimately creates more vulnerable subjects. So we consider the history Ustaoğlu is talking about, often this sort of theme of suppression of internal threats of security comes up. So for example, Ustaoğlu claims that she used, she talked a little bit about the historical sources she used, and she claims Taner Akçam was an important influence for her. And in his account, he notes how the sort of state narrative of this was that the deportations of the Black Sea Pontic Greeks were to prevent them from collaborating with the advancing Russians. And then if you turn to the 1970s, there's still this question of striving for national stability and security, and how civilians end up as victims. So the 1970s are known to be characterized in Turkey by economic hardship, a volatile government, a lot of street violence between polarized political groups. And of course, the 1970s, these conflicts lead up to the military coup of 1980, which in itself also resulted in the brutal suppression of political activists. And as Ustaoğlu mentions in her quote, tolerance of others is also at a low, and you can see it in the film. She has villagers treat any people identified as Greek Orthodox with hostility. So true to Ustaoğlu's stated commitment to showing the sufferings of ordinary lives, the film makes its political statement by showing the proliferation of various vulnerable, marginalized people across this spectrum of historical periods. So essentially, while this history is in the background, Ustaoğlu's emphasis is really on lived experience of people, and she uses a lot of local actors and such to bring that out. So for the remainder of this talk, I'll look at an example. I'll look at a few key moments from the film in which Ustaoğlu highlights a set of individuals who are marginalized in different ways vis-a-vis the state, and then also how she juxtaposes these individuals with each other. And in doing so, also brings into conversation the 1916 and 1975 contexts. And one of the ways I argue Ustaoğlu does this on a formal level is using the cinematic technique of cross-cutting, also known as parallel editing. Cross-cutting describes when the camera cuts back and forth between scenes that are taking place, often simultaneously, but in different locations. And film scholars have often theorized cross-cutting as a way in which the filmmaker communicates a message to the spectator in a persuasive way. And usually it's in the case of trying to convince the spectator of connections between the film's narrative that might seem disparate. And those are usually the two sorts of something in the two scenes that the camera is switching between. It's something we've all seen often in film, whether we've reflected on what that's doing to our understanding of the film or not. So the sequence of cross-cutting that I'm going to talk about here establishes lines of connection between Ayşe and a set of secondary characters, Mehmet, Cengiz, and these unnamed political activists in the street. So the sequence opens with a scene of Ayşe sitting alone at her window throughout the night, looking through the curtain at the street. It's still day here, but then it becomes night. And in the middle of the night, she sees this group of individuals, we probably presume leftist activists paste a poster to the wall, then they flee. And moments later, a car, government, police, maybe paramilitary arrive, they tear down the poster and leave the shreds of it on the wall. And during this scene, the camera adopts Ayşe's point of view, as you can see here, which is obstructed due to the curtain's lace and also just the lack of light. And this is emblematic of something Ustaoğlu does throughout this film, that she gives us these indirect or unclear shots, which are representative of the physical and social marginality of the characters. In this case, both Ayşe, who watches in secret, also harbors her own secrets, and the political activists who are trying to operate in secret in the street. So that kind of launches the cross-cutting sequence, which now is going to switch between Ayşe and Mehmet and continue with this sort of same theme. So the scenes with Mehmet almost always show him in school. And so this one shows him arriving at his elementary school, where the students are repeating this memorized set of proclamations of their loyalty to the nation. And this is emblematic of all of the schooling scenes with Mehmet, where his school is always portrayed as nationalistic, reflecting how education in Turkey has been a tool for unifying the nation around centralized set of values, language, notion of national identity. And in an earlier school scene, Mehmet had been punished for not being able to recite those praises of the nation along with the other students. And so the film has already sort of established Mehmet as this character who exists in some sense with intention with the state schooling and mainstream notions of national identity. So in the present scene, something kind of similar happens. Instead of staying with the students, Mehmet, you can see him running off, sees his friend Cengiz hiding in the edge of the school courtyard and sprints off to join him and spends the rest of the day skipping school in Cengiz's company. So the character of Cengiz does not attend school. He was not counted by the census officials who visited at the beginning of the film. He lives sort of on the outskirts of the village. He's the son of a communist, and Cengiz believes his father, or wants to believe his father, has fled to Russia, but the rumors going around the village suggest his father was killed due to his politics. He's kind of another marginalized figure who comes into the conversation. So at this point, now the speed of the sort of switches the camera back and forth between Cengiz and Mehmet on the one hand and Ayşe on the other increases. And I argue that as it increases, Ustaoğlu kind of makes this knot of connection tighter between the set of marginalized characters she has presented to us. So while Mehmet and Cengiz are here, Ayşe is also sort of in a secluded place, alone in her home, in her storeroom, where she's going through her old things and brings out this box with old photographs inside. One of the main photographs she's looking for is this photograph she had of her family before the deportations. And when she uncovers this piece of evidence of her past that she must keep hidden away, the spectator is again sort of reminded of this paranoia in the background, or this intolerance, as Ustaoğlu put it, towards non-Sunni Muslims that kind of haunts each scene with Ayşe. This scene brings us back to an earlier scene, the opening scene of the film, where Ayşe was visited by the census officials. In a sort of tense moment, she gives them her false public identity, false name and birthplace without attracting suspicion. But in the background, there's this news reporter reminding citizens to comply with the census officials or be punished, which sort of emphasizes this tense relationship in which Ayşe is living now back in the place she was born. So overall, at the conclusion of this cross-cutting sequence, we remark that it has sort of underlined how Ayşe, Mehmet, Cengiz, the activists, all gravitate towards the social and physical margins of the community, usually in an effort to avoid detection by the state in some form. Because our view switches back and forth between them, we're encouraged to draw that line of comparison between them. And also by juxtaposing the stories, the film does something a little bit cross-temporal. It tries to show patterns in human experiences under successive regimes in the same place. And Ayşe kind of embodies that 1916 history, and she brings it into the conversation. And the other characters more represent the continued tendency of the state in 1975 to turn to this language of threats. So I'll just say a few concluding remarks to finish off, which I'm not going to have time to go more detail into this, but just one other, I think, important narrative effect of the cross-cutting technique, which also I think is part of the political message Ustaoğlu is trying to make in this and many of her films, is that it is a way in which she builds interpersonal relationships between her characters. So in this case, you see that cross-cutting building a relationship between Mehmet and Ayşe and Cengiz. So with Mehmet and Ayşe in particular, the cross-cutting juxtaposes them, and then the film emphasizes this link by ending the cross-cutting sequence with the two characters physically together in the same frame, as you see here. I won't go into it. There's history and film theory of tracking how cross-cutting has been used to build relationships or connections between characters like this. I think it's also important that in the narrative, Mehmet becomes an aid to both Ayşe and Cengiz. He sort of indirectly helps Ayşe connect with someone who helps her get back in contact with her brother. And then when Cengiz is caught by the authorities and placed in a state orphanage, Mehmet helps him escape. And so this kind of interpersonal bond, especially when it operates across lines of age, ethnicity, religion, is central to the film, and it's a common feature of Ustaoğlu's films. What Ustaoğlu terms that government paranoia never ceases to negatively affect the lives of the figures in her film. So the film does not suggest that the 1916 past can be overcome, as its effects and underlying logic continue to assault the diegetic present. But with these interpersonal relationships, like the thing that cross-cutting is also doing in the film is sort of presenting this one, is showing a slightly optimistic, presenting one sliver of hope is how I termed it, that these relationships the marginalized characters form with each other may at least be able to help them assert some degree of agency, even if limited, and better cope with their environment. And I will conclude there. Thank you all so much.
Excellent. Awesome. Thanks, Claire. I think that certainly your note on multidirectionality will come up in a couple of different contexts. You gave a preview for us of that and thinking about the kind of connections between state-sponsored violence over time. And so this kind of vertical connection temporality-wise and the targeting of the violence targeted toward different communities and in that sense, but also kind of the multidirectionality on a horizontal plane. We can connect back to, of course, Jacob's work and I think what will come in a lot of what will come next and so forth. So something to think about and something to hold on to. So I will then end the talks by giving my own. So give me 1 second as I transition. Okay, perfect. All right, so my talk is when the study of settler mnemonics meets the study of literature. And so I want to kind of begin by giving you some context for where this comes from and specifically why I study narrative frames. That was in the particular paper. So this workshop paper that I gave stems from my larger book project, a map of displaced nested memory and the afterlives of removal. And there I'm articulating nested memory in terms of the structure of this intergenerational transmission of memory in the face of the recursivity of trauma. And so Claire, when I said the note about multidirectionality and the vertical and the horizontal, certainly that's on my mind. The extract that I gave for the workshop today focuses on narrative frames and settler mnemonics to delineate the grounds for comparison in the rest of the project. So in the particular chapter, I looked at three novels. I gave for you guys in the workshop my analysis of Three Apples Fell from Heaven, my Michelin Aharonian Markham, and They're There by Tommy Orange. I wasn't able to fit in Susan Abulhawa's text. So I'll give you a little preview. Each vignette in Three Apples Fell from Heaven is told from the perspective of a different character who watches the catastrophe of 1915 and its aftermath unfold. The storytellers include those who are sent on the death march to Dayr. Of course, there's a connection there with Elyse. Those who stay behind or are rescued but forced to assimilate either way, and those who end up in diaspora, as in Beirut. So Abulhawa is the blue between sky and water, follows a Palestinian family and their neighbors who were forced to leave their village of Beit Deras in 1948 and walk to Gaza, as well as their descendants who are both in Gaza and the US. And then finally, They're There depicts an urban American Indian community in contemporary Oakland, and the community's determination to be recognized as a present tense people in the face of a 500-year-old campaign of assimilation, absorption, and erasure. So genocide is presented in that frame. Now, the arguments that I made in the paper and the larger chapter is to identify these authors as witnesses to disappearing history. I'll explain why I'm using the word disappearing history and what I mean by that in a moment. But in recognizing, positioning these authors as witnesses to disappearing history, I then argued that they're developing frame narratives that conceptualize the intersecting practices of settler subjectivity, of governmentality, and memory work. And that in what they do through the narrative forms is ultimately depict that in this intergenerational transmission of memory, what's passed on is not just knowledge that these collective events happened, but there's also knowledge about how the nation state treats communal memory of removal. So I am a literary scholar who also works with theory and vice versa. And so I'm going to bring literature to bear on theory and the other way around. And in particular, this work by Kevin Bryneel on settler memory. In the version that I gave you for the workshop, I used his earlier work in one of the essays codenamed Geronimo. I have to go back and revisit now that Bryneel's text is actually published in book form, the manuscript. But what Bryneel argues is that rather than forgetting or amnesia to describe how the US status power enforces indigenous territorial dispossession, he's offering the concept of settler memory, and moreover settler mnemonics, which circumscribe the functions, practices, and products of memory of colonial dispossession and settlement that shape settler subjectivity and governmentality in liberal colonial contexts like the US. So what he says essentially is that settler society articulates collective knowledge of the past and present of settler colonial violence and dispossession, but in that naming actually disavows the political relevance of that memory by refusing and absenting the present of indigenous peoples as contemporary agents. So in essence, by situating indigenous peoples and indigeneity as part of the nation's past rather than its present, the nation state perpetuates and legitimates violence and dispossession. So you might be asking, why do I work with this, and why might I learn from this particular framework? And especially when in the Armenian case, we study state memory work in terms of denial. My goal is not to say that we should to throw away or move away from understandings of denial, that we should continue to name them, of course, in those processes. But this is also part of a thought project, and it is born out of a couple of different moves. So recent scholarship that can help us situate the study of the Armenian genocide within connected histories of the region and their legacies, especially in terms of removal. I'll show you what that means in a minute. It also has to do with the rhetoric of settlement and colonization emerging out of our fields. So I'm really grateful that we had this morning's panel, precisely because we saw that rhetoric coming out. And then finally, because of surprising documents on the Ottoman Empire from the seat of US Empire. So again, why? So I'm particularly struck by Laura Robson's work, States of Separation. And here in the ways in which the removal of Armenians, of course, as part of the genocidal process, is then situated within a legacy in terms of, as she writes, a development that would become a theme in removals and resettlements across the Middle East and elsewhere throughout the 20th century. So certainly there's a way in which we can think about connecting various histories and thinking about the study of genocide within a larger study of the Armenian genocide within maybe its own, let's say, aftermath or legacies. I also think about it in relation to Asli X's work, who in the context of the Greek-Turkish exchange, and Claire, that this would be particularly relevant to you. She writes, for those seeking segregative solutions, the Greek-Turkish exchange not only constituted a legal precedent, but also a successful case of so-called repatriation. The exchange has therefore become a reference point for other cases, such as the Potsdam Agreement of 1935, the partition of India in 1947, of Palestine in 1948, and Cyprus in 1974. So what I'm essentially saying is there's ways in which that we can enter and study the Armenian genocide within context of empire and colonization. We certainly saw that in the first panel, and we might think about the legacies and what that removal might mean and shape in other succeeding acts. Now, of course, central to this in the ways that why I enter and think about the relevance of Bryneel's work came also from kind of the work that Mehmet introduced us, and certainly Mehmet's larger work, and we were thinking of the concept of colonization to denote the redistribution of Armenians' property as a form of internal colonization. And last night, Dirk, you gave us a kind of a preview, you made a gesture to Bloxham's work, and certainly there, as Bloxham is using the notion of internal colonization from, as he says, observers at the time, at least one observer, who thought about the settlement of Muslims instead of Armenians in a sort of internal colonization. So we're moving through this rhetoric. And of course, Ella, I'm so grateful that we had you this morning And I'm fascinated in one of the ways in which Ella is using these frameworks in the terms is what she calls the Ottoman settler. And in thinking about immigrant settlement, to categorize and make legible populations spaces to erase existing communities. And of course, this notion of productivity and the concept of empty lands that she is articulating for us as she's coming to and naming this notion of the Ottoman settler. So we're moving in these directions, and that for me, that's where I ultimately ask, what might that mean in terms of a kind of a trickle down effect? Not that I necessarily want to use economic terms, I'm not an economist, but so be it. It also means, as I said, sometimes sitting with surprising documents. Keith, I think you're going to like these documents for various reasons. And one of these documents is a piece titled Internal Duties in the Publication of Armenia, which is a journal published in 1904 outside of Boston. And it had these honorary editors we see from Lucia Ames Mead to William Lloyd Garrison to Julia Ward Howe. And there's a particular, he's nodding his head, I see it. Right, and the article that Gilman writes in it, and it's fascinating that there's a reference here of our Indian policy, for instance, would profit much if we committed ourselves to a high standard of international agreement on the treatment of subject races. Again, my goal is not to simply equate or transpose or draw these one-to-one equations, but it is to sit with maybe cacophony and ask and think through these questions and what they might mean in revisiting memory work. And relatedly, Keith, you're going to also really appreciate this one in another issue later on. I don't know who Edgar Upton is. I haven't traced his identity, but it's really fascinating to me that notwithstanding this heritage of trustworthiness to many people in both Turkey and Russia, the Armenian is anathema, to change a Western saying about the Indian in their sight, the only good Armenian is the dead Armenian. So we have these kind of documents that position us to think through, perhaps, and sit with. And then finally, another one from the Cherokee Advocate. This is from 1896. I think this would have been particularly interesting, perhaps, to Mehmet. The Cherokee Advocate as a successor to the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, and in particular, the piece They Protest. It is a statement that is undersigned by the delegates of the Cherokee Creek and Seminole Nations of Indians in Indian Territory. They write, it critiques the U.S. government, reminding its audience of its obligations dictated by federal Indian policy or caring for the interest of a ward. Again, this is fascinating because given the United States, given the rhetoric of ward. So they're critiquing the government, calling its attention to its promise of caring for the interest of a ward, and the attitude of the relationship of indigenous sovereignty within the U.S. and that kind of federal Indian policy and treaty relationship. Here, Keith, I think this is also relevant to you and fascinating in the ways that you think about the Near East relief treatment of orphans and the rhetoric of America's wards. And ward has a particularly specter of federal Indian policy. When we think of the 1831 U.S. Supreme Court case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, in which Chief Justice John Marshall defined Indian tribes as domestic dependent nations, and the legal relationship between tribes in the U.S. is that of a ward to its guardian. So again, sometimes my work is sitting with these various maybe empires in the ways that they thoughts and knowledge and articulations might have occurred historically that hasn't necessarily shaped the ways in which we think about memory in the aftermath of genocide. All right. And that ultimately then comes to allow me to work with the second notion of second kind of theoretical framework, and specifically this notion of disappearing history. So the way that I articulate disappearing history stands in contrast to Kathy Caruth's use of disappearing history, which she develops in her analysis of Sigmund Freud's work, and by extension, the writing of a psychoanalytic theory. So Caruth asserts that psychoanalytic thoughts develop in the face of the threat of a world that was disappearing in the destruction of 2 world wars. So she's taking up the work of Freud, of Balzac, of Dorfman, Arendt, and Derrida. And she writes that in the case of Hannah Arendt's writing, the political writings, that Arendt described the unfolding of a 20th century political history that seems to no longer to establish, but rather to eliminate the very possibility of its own remembrance. Now, then she also, as across the text that she reads, she's saying that there's a theme that emerges, the persistence of a language the language of what Freud calls life drive, or a mode of speaking and of writing that bears witness to the past by turning toward the future. But it's in that context, in this context of maybe the cacophony of how we think about settlement and colonization and genocide, that I ultimately come to and ask, but what persistent language arises in the works that take on the willful disappearance of history through projects of empire, settler coloniality, and nation state building? And so it is from those kind of bridges that I make that I come to my analysis of the novels. I won't go give you a full analysis of either because the paper was quite long, but I'll give you at least some snapshots of them. So one of the snapshots that I want to give you guys is from Three Apples Fell from Heaven, and it is in particular the vignette, A Sad Ending Again. So I say that in this particular vignette, Markham emphasizes that the logic of elimination is not confined to physical destruction and bodily death, but rather it entails and attempts to contain memory of Native people's lived experience on land prior to settlers' arrival. So that vignette commences with a town crier who announces, "No town here, no town here. Move down the hill, there is no town here." The vignette continues, "It was not long afterward that a great flood came, a fire or plague, an earthquake that shook the foundations of Harpet." Of course, flood, fire, earthquake connote natural disasters. And in the paper, I think about those terms, the term fire, and how we in the Armenian context think about the words translated of arid, of catastrophe, and thinking about the ways that in the contemporaneous moment, Armenians might have conceptualized what was unfolding before them in these various terms, including arid, because of course, genocide gets coined in 48. So after the deportations of Armenians in the representation of the novel, the town crier walks through the streets of Mezre, renaming it Elyse, and he asks, "Who believes the fables and rumors of the jinn against history stories? Soon we'll have tomes of books to elucidate what has always been true today and yesterday for 2,000 years or more. 2,000 years or more. Elyse, my son, Elyse today and yesterday, you're the hope and the pride of the new nation. What do you say? There's never been another." The town crier reports his progress to his boss, the commander, and upon hearing the news, the commander envisions that there will be some confusion, that the post may be delayed, that the cartographers will require overtime and extra pay. He reasons, however, that soon the villages will have always existed in this way, and concludes, "It's better than dead, it's history." The commander then assigns truth value to the history produced in the tomes of books. As the passage suggests, local histories penned by settlers remain central to this construction of the new nation after the removal of Armenians. The commander's claim about history also explains what another character, Martyros, in the statement that he gives to two Armenian women in another one of the stories, about the men who are left to die in a pile at the edge of Harpet. So when that character Martyros, he indicates that he's proof that the men have not been murdered. He refers to work of communal memory informed by his testimony, which disrupts national memory, meaning the history of what has always been true today and yesterday for 2,000 years or more that the commander and the town criers circulate, especially after the Armenians are removed and sent to their Zur. So again, brief snapshot of the text, and I will give you another kind of snapshot, but specifically from there. So in the interlude, the first of the two-part narrative frame, Tommy Orange describes the effects of settler mnemonics in a way that resonates with Abu Hawa's phrasing, quote, "The violence of an alien story burned those meandering native days," and quote, the phrases, "It's better than dead, it's history," or the what has always been true today and yesterday for 2,000 years or more, that refrain that is presented in Markham's novel. So in Orange's novel, the narrator indicates, "The wound that was made when white people came and took all that they took has never healed. An unattended wound gets infected, becomes a new kind of wound, like the history of what actually happened became a new kind of history. All these stories that we haven't been telling all this time, that we haven't been listening to, are just part of what we need to heal." So through the line, the history of what actually happened became a new kind of history, and how this new story leaves an open wound, Orange, like Markham and Abu Hawa, produce a kind of story map which spatializes the transmission of memory when the past has not yet passed. And what I mean by that is to describe the movement of American Indians from reservations to places like Oakland, the narrator in the prologue tells readers, this was part of the Indian Relocation Act, which is part of Indian termination policy, which is exactly what it sounds like. Make them look and act like us, become us, and so disappear. But it wasn't like that. Orange thus spatializes memory in the context of federal Indian policy, which, as the narrator suggests, operationalizes the logic of elimination through termination policy repackaged under a different title. Now, in the narrative frame, Orange also turns to the image of flying bullets to articulate the ways in which American Indian and First Nations people relate to the land through memory work and how those remembrance practices counter colonizers' practices of nation-state building. The narrator begins, when they first came for us with their bullets, we didn't stop moving even though the bullets moved twice as fast as the sound of our screams. Orange reiterates his point about native transmotion when the narrator continues, we kept on even when we saw the bullets send our bodies flailing through the air like flags, like the many flags and buildings that went in place of everything we knew this land to be before. By asserting knowledge of relationalities both to and on land before the arrival of settlers, the narrator counters settlers' discourses of discovery, possession, and development. And this is something perhaps to think about in relation to Ella's work. That is, these practices of nations building perpetuate the legal fiction of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, meaning such discourses transform indigenous people into homo nullius, inhabitants of lands emptied and awaiting arrival. First case, I'm citing Eileen Morton Robinson, and in the latter, Jody Berg. So then in the novel, the narrator suggests that the bullets fired by colonizers cause wounds beyond those that appear on the body. And the narrator identifies those bullets used to massacre American Indians as premonitions, ghosts from dreams of a hard, fast future. Now those premonitions and ghosts concern the memory work that informs the settler vision of the American past. In Oakland and sometime in the present in 2000s, the narrator also reflects the stray bullets and consequences are landing on our unsuspecting bodies even now. I'll turn towards a conclusion so that we have enough time, of course, for Q&A, but I'll say actually that in lieu of a conclusion, a note of hope. That is, if you know me, you know that rather than conclusions, I much prefer to end by thinking about possibility, of dreaming, of imagining, and simply ending with a forward-looking outlook. If there's anything I think to take away from my paper, it is something that I hope we take away from the workshop overall. And that is the historian, the literary studies scholar, the film studies scholar, the theorist, the anthropologist, sociologist, and beyond need to sit with and make meaning together with our writers and artists. And I would add to that, not just need, but that we can indeed sit together and productively participate in that meaning making. Because as I think what my paper ultimately shows, without that meaning making of fields transiting with one another, then I am ultimately not able to do the kinds of literary analysis that I do in my paper. So I will end with for you guys with that note of positivity. All right. So as following this morning's, we will have opportunity now for Q&A. I invite the audience to submit your questions through the Q&A feature. I will also, doing what Matthew did this morning, give you guys particular questions, but in the spirit of today's workshop, I'm going to, for our panelists, give particular questions, but frame them in two ways. First, frame them with kind of hoping to make connections to the work of our keynotes and the work of our other scholars that we've been here tonight. And also, as we've been thinking through, not to lose sight of kind of critical Indigenous studies and settler colonial studies. I know for our panelists, those are not fields that you engage. I know for our audience, that isn't necessarily, those aren't necessarily fields that we engage. But for a conference on dispossession and its legacies, I think it's important to think about those fields in relation to what the legacies of this conference and this workshop might be. So bear with me, and we'll give you the questions that I'm thinking through for you. But again, as I said, making those kind of two different moves. So Jacob, I think what was really fascinating for me in your work is, of course, the memory and the connections and how you come and think through what does it mean to think about memory and kind of connective work. Certainly we saw that with Claire and how she thinks through multi-directional memory. What I'm also fascinated by in your work is the gesture to think about the Armenian genocide in relation to, as you said, the Rwanda genocide of Tutsi. And in particular, because there's a passage that I'm thinking about, Dirk, you referenced it last night. It is for scholars working in the context of settler colonial studies, something that is cited often. You made that note for us, Dirk. And it is specifically Patrick Wolf's Settler Colonialism and Elimination of the Native. And so I'll read, there's a particular line that I continually sit with and wrestle with, and I'll put it on the table because it's interesting and you'll see why. So in that particular article, Wolf argues that the best known of all genocides was internal to Europe, while genocides that have been perpetuated in, for example, Armenia, Cambodia, Rwanda, or one period Darfur do not seem to be assignable to settler colonialism. So Wolf, of course, was not a settler, was not in the context of Armenian studies or Ottoman studies a scholar in that way, but it would be interesting to think about what he might have reflected if he were able to be present with us today. Dirk, I think that what we're coming to in the study of the Armenian genocide through our inherited frameworks in the study of genocide, and in relation to what we're seeing now and emerging with our engagement with settler colonial studies, you were touching on that last night, I think, and getting us to think through entering that question of the study of genocide through these inherited trajectories, inherited methodologies, and kind of these more newer modes of thinking about settler colonialism, what they might open and what tensions they might bring. Keith, I think this will be something for you that'll be interesting to think about, because I know you also think about Rwanda, and I'm not going to take your thunder away, but certainly as you're thinking through this notion of indigenous genocide and what that might mean in the Armenian context. So I want to put it on the table. Jacob, I know that's not something you can work through, but it'll be something I think that in the legacies of this conference might be something that we continually come to. What I do want to pose for you and situate your work within kind of also larger moves that we're seeing in the study of our memory work in the Armenian case. So certainly, let me pull up one other piece. So your co-author, so Dr. Göçek, certainly in denial of violence on and past Turkish present collective violence against Armenians. And there's a gesture that you make in thinking about what you study in terms of denialism and kind of the nation state and structural remembering might actually come to bear in the context of the US and violence towards African Americans and enslavement, and also American Indians. So you make that really interesting gesture. It's brief, but there's a kind of connected work that's happening. Taner Akçam in a speech also kind of makes this gesture to what might the memory work, Turkish state, nation state memory work of the Armenian genocide come to bear in relation to the US nation and its memory in terms of its territorial founding. Certainly also makes a reference to the context of the Palestinian experience. He also makes a reference to the context of apartheid. Now, elsewhere, we have the work of Nadir Şalhub-Kevorkian, who also thinks about the context of Armenian genocide denial, and specifically uses that to think through Israeli state surveillance of Palestinian collective memory. So there's a lot of ways that kind of how we think about memory in relation to the Armenian genocide is transiting and making connections for us. And so, Jacob, the question that I ultimately that I want to bring to you is that dissertations are born out of what excites us, what propels us, what guides us. And so I would be curious to have you think through and reflect on what was valuable for you, what was valuable in thinking in comparison, what inspiration might you take away from that methodology or the content that you ultimately found in this reading in this juxtaposition. So I know that's where you are kind of maybe thinking through where you are. I'm trying to be cognizant of where you are as a young and emerging scholar. And so maybe that reflection can be something that will get us through where can we go from here. And so what might that mean for you? And perhaps it'll inspire a dissertation, who knows? Elyse, I want to, again, make similar gestures for you. And I have been sitting and thinking of your work in relation to Robert's and the ways that Robert gave us last night, genealogies of thought, especially, of course, in relation to dispossession. And their land became central. I am thinking about bones, and in some ways, I wonder if bones give us a genealogy of thought in relation to the afterlife of dispossession. Now, again, kind of moving comparatively, bones have come up in a couple of different places. So I have in mind the poetry of Hyde Erdrich. So Hyde Erdrich is Turtle Mountain, from the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe, and particularly the collection National Monuments. And there, bones and burial grounds are part of a way of national, indigenous tribal national memory. And certainly she's playing on the word national monuments in relation to US nation state and US national monuments and what is remembered. I also have in mind Leanne Simpson's Islands of Decolonial Love, and in particular, one of the poems in which Leanne, who's Nishnawig in the context of First Nations in Canada, and it is viewpoint of bones and skulls who are thinking and narrating their experience in relation to settlers. Now, bones in another context, you in your paper cite of Peter Balakian in that moment when the 60 minutes, he certainly comes to it in Black Dog of Fate, the poem, I think it's Granny Making Soup, and where the bones are triggering those kinds of memories for him. The question that I want to pose for you, not again specifically in the context of settler colonial studies and indigenous studies, but it's in the context of Syria. And what I'm particularly interested in is how the civil war and the refugee crisis, what effects might have had in terms of the remembrance practices, in relation to bones and these sites that you visited. Does something change? Do individuals' relationships change over time? What's new? Is something carried? We might also think about this in relation to Syrian civil society at large, and what might, let's say, the Armenian memory practices in relation to these bones, what might it have prompted for, again, civil society at large? I also think there's a parallel, perhaps if we think about the Lebanese civil war, we might think about the Armenian experience nested within that, but what does it mean to witness upheaval when part of your society has arrived and our descendants, refugees, have experienced upheaval? Or in relation, perhaps, as we think about Armenian refugees in Armenia, and here's what's fascinating, often I think in Armenian diasporic studies, we think about the Soviet and post-Republic experience of migration into these more established communities in the US of like Syrian or Iraqi or Lebanese Armenians. But what might it mean for, let's say, Armenians in the context of the Syrian civil war and refugee crises to have arrived in Armenia? And are there moments in which these kind of memories in relation to bones, are they carried? So I guess in one way to ask that, is there a larger way in which this kind of more current event that has happened is reframing or opening new avenues of engagement for memory work that you see? And then Claire, I'm going to be slightly biased here. Claire and I were graduate students. So I have a larger sense of your own trajectory and the ways in that you work through your project and where it developed and how it went. For you, we've talked about Joy Harjo, who's Muskogee Creek, and particularly her poem Conflict Resolutions. You've seen it, and we've looked at it together. And it is a fascinating poem in which the narration of dispossession and its afterlives, she's working through kinds of different voices, different narrative voices. On the one hand, the voice of the settler who's engaged in the treaty making, the voice of the native who is on the receiving end of that treaty making moment. Then in the afterlives, the kind of protestation, the call to account, the location, and the challenging of what has always been true, perhaps if we connect back to Markham's. So in that sense, they're kind of different narrative voices and documents that are being used there. Now, as I think through your own work and your own trajectory, and hopefully you'll allow me to disclose and not get too upset with me for doing this, I think about the ways in which you also have worked with the work of Karen Karkaşlı, a Turkish Armenian poet and writer. I know it doesn't make an appearance in your dissertation, but I also think about when you were constructing your exams and kind of the text you chose, and there you included memoir. I know in your dissertation you also take up graphic novel. So in thinking in thinking of inspiration, I would ask of you, what does it mean for you in the story that you ultimately tell, the narrative that you are constructing in your dissertation? And for you, that dissertation is thinking about representations of state violence and vulnerability, and specifically by looking at literatures by minorities in France and Turkey. Now, what are those different documents? What are those different narratives, those different genres? What do they afford you? How do they illuminate one another? Is there ever any point where one becomes much more useful to you in the story that you want to tell in the dissertation, or perhaps limiting? So the different ways to think through. I won't ask myself a question, but after you guys talk, I might just reflect on my own trajectory as means of not letting you guys all alone to answer all of those questions. So I'll extract myself at the moment and turn it over to you guys. And whoever wants to perhaps jump in first.
I can, since you asked my question first. I guess it's fair that I had the most time to think, but there's still so much to think about. So this isn't a clear answer. I guess one thing that the comparison part brings up is one of the groups in Rwanda that people don't really talk about is the Twa, which is the indigenous group that it doesn't fit into that perpetrator victim binary again. And so in Rwanda now, in the 27-ish years after the genocide, they have these like minority groups that are protected by the Constitution, and the Twa are part of them. But you cannot call them Twa because it's an ethnicity group, and ethnic groups are made illegal by the Constitution as well because of the genocide. So it's very complicated when we think about how to value the identities of these people that have been indigenous, but don't fit into that victim perpetrator when we emphasize the notion of genocide as like the evil, the crime of crimes. What do we do for all the other people that have been harmed within that? And then I guess for the comparative aspect, there's so much there. I think oftentimes we get siloed in our one way of thinking. So comparative, not only in the epistemology of how we come to think about things, but also in our cases as well. And I don't think we can deny that everything is connected in our globalized world. So through these processes, things relate. And I don't think that necessarily everything has to be perfect in these comparisons, but when we think about what the connections do highlight and illuminate for what we can learn to move forward, I think that's important. I liked your conclusion at the end of your presentation, Helen, and how we need to look forward, and sociologists like to highlight inequalities and problems and power, but we need to move forward beyond that and think about what we can do to make more of a better, more equitable society. And the last thing, I think when all of you were presenting, I kept thinking about comparisons. So Elyse, there's actually a memorials in Rwanda, I'm sure you're familiar, where they just have bones on display, the one Murambe. So even through these presentations, there's so many comparisons there, and there's so much conversation about what does it mean to have people's loved ones, on display as these bones. But that's like the Westerner perspective. And then when you talk to people in Rwanda, it's like, no, we need tourists to see these so that this never happens again. And they don't want to remove the bones. And even though like they still have, in some of the museums, they still have like children's homework that the kids brought with them because they thought they were just going to be there for a few days. There's still like blood splattered on the walls and things like that. So the very affect and visceral, emotions that come from these, they're also comparisons on what they mean for moving forward. And then, yeah, I think that's it. I'll see if Müge has anything to add to the comparison part real quick too.
Dr. Göçek, you are smiling, and always glad when you see an advisor smiling, so chime in.
Well, Jacob is brilliant, so hey, there isn't much to do, but I just wanted to mention, Helen, that what I'm doing now in developing this theory is that empirically I'm looking at the Armenian and Kurdish experiences. I mean, one can argue that Kurds also, they think that they're going through perpetual genocide. I mean, as opposed to the Armenians who went through it once. I mean, they think because of how they treated the Armenians, what they're going through is like perpetually being destroyed. And I'm comparing them to Native Americans and African Americans' experiences in the United States. So that's why I'm immersed in Native American history, which made me very excited when both Elyse and you talked about that. So we'll see what happens. As you say, I think these comparisons bring up a lot about patterns of collective violence as they travel across societies. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think building on that, I think you said patterns, but also I think this came up in the first panel and elsewhere. I think Matthew, when he posed that question to you, Dirk, and Matthew, I know from your own work, we've talked about this in the ways that Matthew used the phrase of chains of dispossession. I think Mehmet's also using it, so that might be something to think about too, the kind of the recursivity that, and how that recursivity might look in different contexts. Yeah, sorry, please, go ahead. Elyse or Claire, either of you.
Oh, I'll go because you mentioned the bones. Thanks, Jacob, for reminding us of the way that bones get used to sort of remember mass atrocity. I was also recalling that pretty amazing documentary, Nostalgia for the Light, and these images of people digging up their disappeared relatives in the desert. And that's again in a different context as Chile, but Okay, so here's what I've learned from people who work on relics is how bones serve this kind of mnemonic quality, you know, for remembrance and for narrating around the dead. And so it's not surprising to me that you found it also in Native American poetry. I'd be interested in reading that poem if you could share it with me.
Yeah, I will happily send.
Thank you. And then, you know, I've learned a lot from, there's actually a scholar who's a theologian and philosopher, Carmen McKendrick, who looks at relics in the United States, actually, uncorrupted flesh that's allegedly uncorrupted flesh of martyrs that's inside some churches, even in the United States. And what she's argued is that these relics are textbooks. So she actually compares them to actual texts and recordings of humans' documents. And so I'm very interested in this idea of bodies as documents. I think many of us are. Okay, so the last part about Syria, and I mean, as far as I know, I don't know of anybody making pilgrimage to these sites. And in October of 2019, a priest from Qamishli, an Armenian priest named, I wrote down his name quickly to remember. His name was Hana Badoyan. He took a trip, a car, just from Haseke, 100 kilometers south to Dayr to inspect the church, the memorial, and to begin planning reconstruction. So inside Syria, the Armenians, you know, the Armenian church in Aleppo was also destroyed, and it was reconstructed already, the damaged parts. So he was leading something similar to reconstruct the site, but his car was gunned down and he was murdered along with everybody in the car. There are just a lot of sleeper cells in Dayr, so any possibility of reconstructing that site or visiting it safely, I think, is just not going to happen. And what I ask at the end of my book, it's almost like your questions preempting the conclusion of my book. So thank you, Helen. But I got to sit and talk to Peter Balakian, and I actually posed these questions because it was 2017, so the war was still quite raging, and asking, you know, what should happen in these spaces at war's end. And so as somebody who, I mean, again, I have my own subjectivity here, but I'm interested in something that would recognize the war, not just, you know, not just the Armenian genocide, whatever kind of activities happen, you know, that I'm going to be conducting in that space in the future, inshallah. I don't want it to be something that's only focused on 1915, but that's focused on 2015. So the untold story are the hundreds, I'm talking about hundreds of Dayr Sunni Muslims who were killed by ISIS. That's the untold story. You had to be reading and combing the Arabic press closely to see that people were being killed in the hundreds in the public square of Dayr. These Sunni tribesmen, were being crucified, were being dismembered publicly to make a display of them. Why? Because they were resisting ISIS. And who are those Dayr Sunni Muslims? They're the same, residents of Dayr who all have Armenian grandmothers, Armenian hababes, as they call them. So they're actually people who had ties, people who would receive Armenians when they would travel there and sometimes perform these excavations. So I try to end on that more kind of comparative note to sort of think about what should happen at war's end. And I'm not probably going to be a person that would have my vision executed there, but I hope that there are other Armenians that would like to see something that's more comprehensive in the future.
Claire, you would be so kind.
All right, so I'll jump in for your question, Helen, which was a great question. Thank you. It really asked me to reflect on the process through which I put together my research as it is today. As you asked me about the different media I work on, which is true that I started off as someone who worked pretty exclusively on prose fiction, particularly the novel and short story, and ended up doing a dissertation that works with a lot of film and graphic novels. And I think I came to this by following my curiosities, but as we all know, that has then practical consequences, which I won't go into, which took a lot of extra time in gaining an extra minor in cinema studies to have the methodology, have the tools to actually study these different media. But I think that the payoff maybe is that it's sort of generative in the sense that it's another form of comparison, as we've just been talking about the values of potentially comparing across context. In some ways, I'm comparing now across media and how they use formal tools in each respective media to make kind of similar points. I mean, something that makes a big difference in my case is that all of the works that I look at, even though it's a variety of media, are quite specific in terms of time in which they were produced. I mean, they're all from turn of the 21st century, early 21st century. And as a result, they're all kind of coming out of a very similar sort of trends in cultural production. I mean, showing sort of typical postmodern characteristics and fragmentation and such, and also even in terms of content, like these interests in sort of identity narratives questioning the nation, like the new political cinema movement that I was speaking about today. So they're all something that I see across them actually is that they're all kind of in similar ways presenting sort of fragmented bits of narrative and juxtaposing them in interesting ways. And those kind of breakdowns and juxtapositions are sort of a similar overarching formal framework that I see working across different media. And so I think that's why often in my work, I'm looking at how different time periods, how different individuals are creatively juxtaposed, not in a way that suggests, that's why I invoked multidirectionality. So I think it's just useful to sort of underline that point, especially when I'm speaking to an interdisciplinary audience, that I'm not talking about empirical equivalencies in the sense of like this history is equivalent to this history. These are more the questions of when you put different people and different histories together in a creative way, what happens at the end? What does it make us think about? How does that change the way in which we make meaning out of the text or the film or whatever it may be? And so like in the case of film, I'm interested in that case in parallel editing when the camera jumps back and forth between different places. I'm also looking at the use of sound, why you use off-screen sound that came from a different diegetic time over an image that takes place at a different time, and why you would put those things together. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. And as I see there are a few questions already out there, so I'll stop there.
Perfect. So I will not speak. No, that wasn't a cop out, but I want to be able, for the sake of our time, to be able to pose the question. Elyse, I think you can see this. Sophia Armin, thank you for this. And there are two to read, and so I'll read it. So this is a question for Elyse. I'm interested in the use of the term pilgrimage in Armenian studies. Excellent question. Particularly how this circulates and then translates in English-based work and often evokes spirituality. Meanwhile, in settler colonialism, colonization studies, indigenous studies, and the notion of return is emphasized, which also speaks to a place, space, belonging. Are further realities revealed in these frameworks? How do you see those descendants as returns? And the question to you is, how do you find through bones, when we put these transnational dispossessions in conversation, that when we are kind of reconstructing, we are also challenging the entire systems that memory making happens, and how we find political community and belonging with, and with whom we find political community and belonging with?
They're good questions. Okay, the first I would say, Dayr al-Zur, I mean, and I can't speak for all Armenians, but the people I've talked to, interviews that I've conducted with 14 different people who went out there, I mean, it's very rare that people would even stay overnight. It clearly is a place that creeps Armenians out. So I'm wondering if return could work for a place that people don't feel settled by. I mean, people don't feel it's home. So just to put it in perspective, people would take a 14-hour drive in one single day. I mean, they would go 7 hours there, you know, do a ritual at the church, often just the church. Sometimes they would go to Margada, which is 70 kilometers north, and then head back. It's an arduous journey, but no one could really answer why they didn't stay overnight. And there was only one person I found that actually stayed overnight. I should mention too that there's one person who keeps going. I forgot to mention this previously, but Antoine Agoudian, the French photographer, French-Armenian photographer, he keeps going back. It's just, he's the only person I know that goes. But the question about pilgrimage is because I do see the fact that these masukner, these relics are referred to as relics, and the fact that there's an attempt at ritual to sort of vacate the haunting of the place and sort of embed the bones in ritual made me think of pilgrimage, but there could be other terms, you know, return is a possible term, but I feel like it might not encapsulate fully how Armenians are thinking about the space, because I see people are unsettled by it. The second idea would be dark tourism. but I chose not to use that term. If somebody feels I should, I would like to hear why. But and then as for the idea of, memory, for me, I've enjoyed this project because I have used conventional state archives. I researched under both Assad regimes and have researched in Turkey. I have a section where I actually show you what's present, the fingerprints of Armenian women in the Ottoman archives, disappeared women who were held in Muslim homes. And even, but I think that actually the non-state archives are giving me something that I actually am looking for, which are those voices. And so if anything, using an interdisciplinary methodology, drawing on these different fields is giving me what I was looking for, which is actually an archive that embraces emotion as something that's not to be dismissed, but that's something that is relevant here. And again, just uplifting the kinds of voices we have in these non-state archives, thinking of the archive as a space of violence.
Yeah, and Sophia, to your question, I think that you're right. That the term, I think, Elyse, you said pilgrimages, and then you said pilgrim, and I hadn't thought about that, just the pilgrim of the pilgrimage, but also within a context, we don't use pioneers, but certainly I come from the context of Utah, where it's a very particular ecosystem of settlement and pioneers and that rhetoric. And so there's something to think through, perhaps, of when we evoke those terms, what happens, what the complications arise, and what language reveals about the transits of these various worlds and contexts. Are there other, there's other question arriving. Oh, Sophia says loved it. So thanks, Sophia. Other comments that our panelists or our participants would like to make. Ella, yes, please. Oh, Ella, your mic, please.
Thank you, Helen. This might be a question that is taken on more fully in the roundtable that's coming up here. But I have really enjoyed this kind of interdisciplinary conversation and coupling it with the comments from last night. I guess what I wonder is, as I do think these cross-empire conversations and also these cross-chronological conversations are so important. But something I've struggled with in my work is in playing with indigeneity as a concept, and sort of recognizing my sense is very outside of that. And I guess I just wonder, like, to what extent do we need the Ottoman Empire to be a settler colonial empire in order to kind of have this basic comparability, and in order to have this kind of premise about the relationship between Armenians and dispossession, or in order to understand the genocide in comparative framework. So again, it might come up more fully next panel, but I still thought these papers resonated with that question I continue to struggle with.
I might, I'll, Dirk, your mic went off. Would you like to say something?
Well, I mean, I had quite a lot to say yesterday, so I don't want to be, this mansplaining older professor guy, so I'm holding back, and everybody's got lots to say, and there's this wonderful roundtable coming, though I'll only catch part of it, I think, because I've got, university meetings on here. They tend to like them on Fridays at Chapel Hill. I mean, I have, little questions and so forth for everyone, but I was intrigued by them all, but I'm not a literary scholar, and I hadn't read the book, seen the film, so I feel reluctant to ask questions, which about issues which are probably plainly obvious for everyone else. But I did have a question for Müge and your collaborator. Is it where are you on the screen?
Jacob's here.
Ah, there you are, Jacob. So you're on my left. Sorry. I mean, I'm a kind of a social science historian, so this is one that methodologically connected with me most directly. I don't know if you've seen my latest book, but it runs very similar arguments, so I'm with you, but I'm wondering whether there's a tension in your paper where between the nominalist claim, that genocide is a contested concept and it's used and defined by power to limit its application to them, and on the other hand, expressing implicit indignation that the Turkish state won't recognize the genocide against the Armenians, wriggling out of its responsibility. I mean, they're kind of two different claims and two different positionalities. One's an ethical or moral one, which is quite certain about what genocide means, and the other one is much more distanced, academic, observational one about how power works. Now, of course, they're connected because you're quite rightly calling out the Turkish state for excusing itself. But as many people have, and Müge has written this like enormous book about it. But I was wondering whether you see there's this tension in your paper, or whether you also reflect on the differences between the cases, which is in the Rwandan case, the victims, the National Liberation Movement, or the paramilitary or military forces, armed forces of the victims, won and set up a state of a minority against a majority. And in the Turkish case, it's the opposite. Does that lead to different memory outcomes?
Okay, you're muted.
That's an excellent question, but I'll have Jacob answer the Rwandan part, and then I'll sort of make a comment on the general gist that we take. Go ahead, Jacob.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think our main issue right now with the paper is the differentiation between genocide as a concept and genocide as like the phenomena occurring. And it's very hard for me to articulate that in words. So I think thanks for bringing that up. And I think in the Rwandan case, it's still that lack of responsibility after the RPF, who ended the genocide, now took over, and the crimes that took place while they were ending the genocide. And now they have changed the name to make it official. It's the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, which makes it so that the Tutsi are the only victims, whereas we know that there were other human rights violations, violences, which human rights scholars documented during and after the case. And bringing it back to the Twa, the indigenous group, is when the Tutsi were the monarch before colonialism, the Twa were used as their like enslaved servants. So again, it's like when the groups kind of they have different victim perpetrator status throughout time, which makes it complicated to just say that they are just the perpetrator or just the bystander. But yeah, no, I could keep going on this. So I'll let Müge take over some too, because it's a complicated answer.
Exactly, and because of that complication, that is why I came up with this idea of triangulation. I mean, and why we're talking about like a transition that continues, because when you triangulate with binarism, there is sort of this implied linearity, which doesn't, of course, as we know, exist, like progress and other things. It's a sort of conception of Western European modernity. And instead, if you sort of triangulate the concept, the actors, and the context, you sort of are then able to, I think, study this tension in and of itself without reducing it to like one actor or the other, to binarism and such. And that is, I think, how we deal with it, is that then you can sort of triangulate and see how power works through this, and how does power work through it across time and place, space. I mean, so that's basically what we're doing then, is sort of using time and space to deconstruct that tension as it gets triangulated. That's the easiest way of telling it, but of course we have to develop it more, because it's a whole new argument that sort of messes things up. But we're very excited about it. Thank you.
Great. Dirk, is there anything else that you want to before I maybe take up
No.
Ella's question?
No, I think we make room for other people.
Let me double check. There is nothing else in the Q&A. Okay, Ella, I think to your question, yes, all the time, constantly, I am thinking about this. And I'll give you a kind of specific way that I'm thinking about this. So full disclosure, the multi-directional memory, yes, Michael is one of my directors and Jody Bird is one of the other directors. And so Jody in The Transitive Empire, right, and Indigenous Critiques of Colonialism, there's a way in which Jody, they are working through the language of native and settler and complicating that by offering the term arrivant. And Jody's coming to that through the work of the African Caribbean poet Camus Brathwaite, and she says to signify those people forced into the Americas through the violence of European and Anglo-American colonialism and imperialism around the globe. So I say that like the point I see is imagining cacophonously is not to collapse those critical indigenous studies and settler colonial studies into simply a conversation about like the native as informant and what can happen in post-colonial studies. But I like the ways in which, for instance, Bird, she writes that critical indigenous theory provides a diagnostic way of reading and interpreting colonial logics that underpin cultural, intellectual, and political discourses. So from these fields, I think I take away modes of inquiry, ways of asking questions, ways of understanding relations, right? And Jody, they continue that, that way of thinking in critical indigenous studies then ultimately asks that settler, native, and arrivant each acknowledge their own positions within empire and reconceptualize space and history to make visible what imperialism and its resultant settler colonialisms and diasporas have sought to obscure. I'm literally quoting that because it's something that I do quote. And so that notion of what are those relations? What's the relation between settler, native, and arrivant in these spaces? How do they acknowledge them? How do they work through those relationships, past and present? How does that naming of those positionalities make visible processes of imperialism, processes of dispossession, right? Like I said last night, the modes and means and of dispossession. So in some cases, what's useful for me as I think about removal, three diverse histories of removal and their afterlives is to use those frameworks, that language, to then think through what is the memory work when we think about these different positionalities, showing us about the logics of dispossession or the logics of imperialization, or of, as you say, the settlement. But then it becomes tricky and complicated. And this is where, right, Dirk, last night when you were speaking and you read a reference to, of course, the French mandate and kind of like the buffer zones in Syria and in Lebanon, like of Armenian refugees from Cilicia. Joan Nucho really writes about this well in relation to Burj Hamid. But how would we, in one context, as people who are removed, how might we travel and hold a different identity positionality? So it's complex, and I think there's no easy answer other than to just sit with the histories and try to name them and make space for all of the different positionalities and the different histories. And I also then think about this in the context of the present. What might it mean when this notion of settler, native, and arrivant, not to transpose it, but in a modern context, right? I'm a scholar interested in memory and migration. And for Syrian refugees who are arriving, let's say in Turkey, I know there's a whole geopolitical discourse and how they're treated and the lived experiences. But people who are arriving and diasporas who are arriving and who might not have that, this settler-native relationship into the space in the legacies post-genocide, in the legacies of the creation of this, the Republic of Nation States and the ways that it's founded. So are they arrivants? Are they diasporas? How are people arriving to this space? So it's just, some things work. They allow me to name and kind of show the logics that underpin maybe these diverse histories of removal, but they also become, I think, complicated and limited. And this is why I think what was really useful in hearing you speak in that immigrant settler, right, perhaps, and what might it mean to juxtapose immigrant and settler, or juxtapose refugee and settler, those two terms together, which often maybe aren't coming to the fore. So then maybe it's that notion of immigrant settler or refugee settler in the Ottoman context that you're working through that then is maybe pushing us to think through, if there is a legacy of, let's say, this workshop or our thoughts and we move forward, that it is not to simply say what we do in the language we are producing is mimicking and applying hastily what is happening in the context of the founding of the US and dispossession to this other context, but rather it is producing its own vocabulary that then can situate and distinguish from, let's say, received traditions and understandings of settler coloniality and settler colonial studies. So I think it's always a, what do we learn from? How do we articulate difference? And how do we then place it as intellectual contributions that mind difference and respect the work of our colleagues, right? We're working there. Is it easy? No, but I am, as one of my colleagues say, I'm the eternal optimist. So I think it can be done. I hope it can be done with respect, care, and ethics. So it's cacophonous, but that's what I have to offer you, I think is what I'll say. Any other final thoughts as we head off for the day? Okay, we are not heading off for the day. This panel will be concluding for the day. However, we have another lovely panel that, of course, Ella alluded to, and I alluded to a little bit, and it is our roundtable. So I invite all of you to come back and join us in about 15 minutes, so 2:45 Eastern, as we take up this roundtable of dispossession, memory, and indigeneity in Ottoman and Armenian studies. So please come back. We'd love to see you there. Thank you to our panelists and to all the others who are here backstage with us. Dirk, thank you again for being with us. And hopefully these conversations will carry forward in different ways. So take care. See you all again, and see you all again later in the talk.